By examining the roots of Nazi evil before the Second World War in Yugoslavia, and of course now Slovenia, as well as post-war legal proceedings. And I would like to invite Assistant Professor Dr. Daniel Siter, our researcher and editor at Alma Mater Europaea, also head of research at the International Center of the Second World War, who deserves a big applause because he's the organizer of today's symposium. Daniel, thank you very much for organizing this group, and now the floor, of course, is yours.
Well, Tanya, thank you very much for the introductory words. It was my pleasure really to organize this important symposium. But firstly, I would like to, of course, thank you, all the distinguished guest speakers, listeners, visitors, for being here today and for supporting this important event. We met with our keynote speaker, Dr. Gideon Greif, roughly 2.5 years ago in Belgrade. In 5 minutes of talking, we found so many synergies and parallel points. It's not even a tiny bit strange that we are today already here and having this and implementing this event, which I know will be the foundation for future collaborations between us as well. And of course, really important, I would like to extend my gratitude and personal thank you note also to our rector, Professor Dr. Ludwig Toplak, and the whole leadership of the Alma Mater Europaea University for always strongly and firmly supporting such events, which today runs under the umbrella of the program group Research of Cultural Formations, which is implemented at the Faculty of Humanities, Institutum Studiorum Humanitatis. So thank you very much. Today I'm going to present the roots of Nazism in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which was my PhD dissertation title, also part of it, the research done by also run by my under the umbrella of my mentor, who is also today here, Professor Dr. Igor Grdina. So historical processes, as we know, and their interpretation can be really, and they are really complex, and they cannot be painted on a black and white board. The largest human warfare, the largest catastrophe in human history, already mentioned, taking lives of more than 60 million people and decisively shaping the post-World War, is far too complex to be conceptually, spatially, and chronologically limited. Between September 1939, so Hitler's invasion of Poland, and official beginning of the Second World War in Europe, and far too complex to end it with the World War II, so with the surrender of Japan in September 1945, especially when we are talking and discussing about the events and the period of the Second World War in Yugoslavia, particularly in the Slovenian part. So from April 1941, when Hitler launched his invasion of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and of course with that the beginning of war in Slovenia, and May 1945 when officially the Second World War ended in Europe, which, by the way, the last battles ended precisely on Slovenian soil days after the official proclamation of Victory Day in Europe. So Second World War is not just a 4-year story between 1941 and 1945. We know all historical events and have original roots, and understanding and examining the story of the Kulturbund and its subversiveness is crucial also for understanding the period of the Second World War. When speaking about the Second World War in Slovenia, we have to point out three periods. So the pre-war, wartime, and post-war period. The latter culminating in a tragic epilogue. For us, is the most important, and for today's lecture, is the pre-war period with the anti-Slovene activity of the Kulturbund organization. Shortly, the fundamental original roots and groundwork for the 6th of April attack, as well as subsequent denationalization, Germanization, all the other terror and horrifying things that happened and were implemented over the Slovene population, had already been laid out in the pre-war activity of the Kulturbund, so which later on became the extended arm of the Nazi expansionist policy. Just briefly, so after the Germans found themselves in the new country, so we are talking firstly about the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Their aim was the organizational unification of all the Germans in the Yugoslavia and establishment of a comprehensive educational program, as well as safekeeping and protecting of their economic, political, social welfare, cultural, artistic, media, music elements, and well as safekeeping other German traditions and customs. So in the beginning, it was completely strictly cultural, social welfare organization of the German minority in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, established in 1920 by the Vojvodina Germans in Novi Sad. Vojvodina Germans back then were still liberal. They were still liberal, and their roots were from the Austrian Germans, who still had the good relations with the Belgrade regime, which was back then officially at the state. But later on, it became officially the political organization, the fifth column organization, paramilitary organization, as well as auxiliary military force, which was implemented for the preparation of the invasion of Yugoslavia. So, as we can see, in the beginning, it was established in Vojvodina under the slogan "Loyalty to the State and the Nation," and also Slovene Germans took part in the first establishing meeting in Novi Sad. Later on, 2 years later, the first Kulturbund cell was established in the Kočevje region, which, by the way, had the most number of Slovene Germans living in Slovenia, but it was officially dissolved and temporarily forbidden already in 1924 because they were already breaching the fact that they are not supposed to be politically active. In Slovenia, it did not experience significant growth until the 1929, or even more significant after 1931, where its activities were once again legally permitted on Slovenian soil. My research conducted in the National Archives in London also proves that the Kulturbund was not merely a Yugoslavian or Slovenian phenomenon. Based on the archival documents, I found out that the Kulturbund cell was also operating in Trieste, Italy, which we can connect with the Nazi perception of the future German port as well. Organizationally, operationally, politically, culturally, consciously, the German minority in Slovenia was by far the strongest minority of all the German minority islands in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. They were oriented quite differently, which showed later on, especially after the Anschluss, so the Nazi annexation of Austria in March 1938, and also when Hitler assumed the position of chancellor a few years earlier in 1933. The activities of the Kulturbund and German minority had in Slovenia special circumstances. They were unique. There were a lot of differences, which made the Slovenian branch of the Kulturbund the most aggressive and most vivid one. For example, we have an example of Ottokar Kernstock, which proves that the traditional Styrian Germans, even the traditional Styrian Germans, were strongly pro-Nazi. Just for a brief description, Ottokar Kernstock was born in 1848 and died in 1928. Born in Maribor, it's a Roman Catholic priest. early supporter of the Hitler movement, Nazi-affiliated poet, leading Styrian National Socialist poet, and ideological thinker of German nationalism. And until recently, which is still shocking, he was also an honorary citizen of the Maribor municipality. Already in 1923, he wrote the Song of the Swastika, so Hakenkreuzlied, a tribute to the Nazi swastika, which later on became the official anthem of the Austrian local branch of the Nazi party. So I don't have time today to describe all the processes which were happening in the development and operation of the Kulturbund. Three key processes happened during the Kulturbund activities. So split, radicalization, Nazification. Split happened between the younger and older parts of the Germans especially in Novi Sad, which consequently also evolved with the radicalization and Nazification, which came then from the Graz center instead of the Vojvodina, the Novi Sad center. In the beginning, the Kulturbund activities were initially strictly cultural, strictly apolitical. Open political engagement was excluded, also written and printed out in the statutes, so the fundamental legal organization document, which were printed on the federal level, and for each local Kulturbund branch, then in a customized form. This we can see the archival document from the archives in Belgrade. It is evident that one of the most vivid method of infiltrating Nazism into the Yugoslavian and Slovenian part was also with the highly systematic purchase of Slovenian lands and real estate at above average purchase prices, especially in the wine growing regions of Ptuj, Slovenske Gorice, Haloze, and so on. And this strategy basically aimed at the destruction of the populated, concentrated Slovenian centers, destruction of Yugoslav life. And this purchase campaigns were mostly done by the rich people, by the rich Germans from the Graz, and of course by the poor Germans who received funding from German Kulturbund centers from Novi Sad. So we can see a few glimpses of pre-war Kulturbund activity. So alongside physical and ideological education, many young Slovenian Germans and Kulturbund members underwent special military drills, military training in the years before the actual Second World War happened, at summer camps, in the forests, shooting lodges, wooden forest cabins and huts in the Drava Banovina, back then the Slovenian part of Yugoslavia, neighboring Austria and Germany. Here, this was the most vivid. The training was modeled after the SA and SS in Germany. They were taught combat, weapon handling, aiming, shooting, while also being indoctrinated with the National Socialist worldview. We can see the Hitler Youth and the Kulturbund members from somewhere in the village of in Styria, August 1935, and the youths from Ptuj formed a swastika out of river mud and pebbles by forest stream. I've discovered many connections between different Kulturbund cells and top and middle layers of Nazi society. For example, we have on the left picture of Helga Fichtenaun, she was a member of Kulturbund cell in Ptuj, taken photo with the Hitler, talking about the state about the situation in the Yugoslav state. Of course, during those conversations, many secret information data was handed to the Nazi officials, which was then used in better preparation for the invasion and subsequent occupation of the Yugoslavia. Connections were also under the pretense of the cultural activities, and music festivals were also happening later on, were also happening during some festivals. For example, in Breslau, we also see the members from the Ptuj Kulturbund cell in 1938 representing the Germans from Yugoslavia. Of course, the Yugoslav authorities knew what was going on, but they were quite tied down because, for example, the problem was that this was also already the period when the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was politically and economically heavily orientated and tied to the economy of the Nazi Germany. Politically, it was surrounded and encircled by the Axis powers, and there were some cases of preventing the spread of Kulturbund cells in Slovenia, but it wasn't that successful because back then, in those periods, the Kulturbund was already well-established organization. It was flexible, it was leadership-wise, mobile, and adaptable force. When the Kulturbund cell was forbidden, the activity just went from illegal Kulturbund cells to the formally allowed German societies in sports, culture, singing, and stuff like that. Ironically, so the Communist Party tried to prevent such activities, and they spread it like different book leaves. For example, with the book "The Hitlerians in Slovenia." The irony was back then that the Communist Party was officially illegal and forbidden, and the Kulturbund back then in the late 1930s was officially allowed to operate. And what is the most important thing for today's lecture is that in later stages of development, the Swabian German Cultural Association, which is the full name, became strongly political, became paramilitary wing and auxiliary military force in preparation for the invasion of Yugoslavia. So the inner Nazified youth of the Kulturbund already prepared the groundwork and foundations for all the later on atrocities that were happening during the World War II in Slovenia, especially through its pre-war subversive activity, the spread of Nazi propaganda, demagoguery, agitation, spread of and showing the Nazi symbols, flags, songs. You saw that earlier on on the display, and of course, most importantly, the systematic anti-Slovene intelligence, espionage, surveillance, betrayal, and denunciation activities carried out mostly by Kulturbund members. So we see the guidelines on the right of how to report, of how to write reports about the state, about the Yugoslavian state, about those who were anti-Nazi orientated, anti-German orientated, and based on those guidelines, special lists were made. In the pre-war period by the Kulturbund, which were handed over later on during the meetings in Graz, just days before the April invasion, to the Nazi Gestapo and police officers and other branches, with which the fate of the Slovenian intelligentsia was sealed already years before, months and years before the invasion action on Yugoslavia happened. I also found some arrest lists which were made based on the Kulturbund reports, especially for my hometown, Rogaška, Slatina, and the neighboring town, Rogatec. They're very detailed, they have a lot of information about the parents, about the birth, and as well as the fact that all those people were against the Yugoslavia's entry into the tripartite pact. Some pre-war espionage report on employed individuals in Pulčane. Mostly those people later on, after the invasion, they were sent to prison, deported, or even killed based on those lists that were made in the pre-war period. So in the end, before the invasion, we have 5 Kulturbund districts, 52 local Kulturbund cells with roughly 12,000 members. Mostly members were younger age, up to 40 years old. And the district leadership for the Slovenian part of the Kulturbund was in Maribor, run by Pastor Johan Baran. We already saw that photo today during the presentation of Boris Hajdinjak. It was mentioned a lot about that photo, but I would like to also to say that the culmination of all the activities in the Slovenian part was basically concluded, of the Kulturbund was concluded with Hitler's arrival to Maribor on 26th of April, where basically Kulturbund members, especially from Maribor, helped to prepare all the venues and for the Hitler's arrival in Maribor. Hitler also greeted the representatives of the Germans in Maribor and also handed a hand to the Johan Baran, the leader of the Kulturbund in Slovenia. For the end, I would also like to point out some things that happened with the Kulturbund at the end of it. So the tragic post-war actions in which the Kulturbund members were also included were of course not entirely fair and humane to the individual. It is impossible to claim that all of the Kulturbund members were working consciously and deliberately against the Yugoslav state and the inhabitants. However, at the end of the war, the new socialist authority believed they could issue the final bill with extra interest of what was for the war atrocities and crimes that were happening during the war, and the foundation which were already laid out in the pre-war period with the Kulturbund activity. After May 1945, the final epilogue and triumphant confrontation began. At the Yugoslav legal level, the initial foundations regarding cooperation activities and membership in the Kulturbund were laid out during the second session of Avnoj, so the anti-fascist Commission Board of the National Liberation of Yugoslavia at the end of November 1943, or between the end of the session and the beginning of 1944. Kulturbund was proclaimed as a treasonous and criminal organization. The activity within the Kulturbund was later defined through numerous decrees and decisions. The most important one was the law on criminal offenses against the nation and the state, as subsequently also the Article 13 of the new constitution, which had severe post-war consequences. One of the most severe was that the new authority demanded collective responsibility for the German minority and Kulturbund members. So this collective judgment extended to its members, many of whom were prosecuted. A lot of them were also not prosecuted and executed without trial. Unfortunately, even those who were not basically enthusiastic supporters, admirers, or promoters of National Socialism, for instance, German nobility and former German aristocrats, they did also not escape the repressions of the new authorities. For example, the Atems family, who for instance did a lot to help the nationally conscious Slovenian families. Their properties were confiscated, and alongside the German minority, they were completely destroyed and wiped out after the war. In brief summary and for the conclusion, so pre-war Kulturbund, later working as member of the Styrian Homeland and Carinthian People Associations, and members of different anti-Slovene commissions, organizations, institutions, played a huge and decisive role in the biggest Nazi atrocities and crimes implemented over the Slovenian population during Second World War. Thank you very much for your attention.